Hello. Today's my reaction towards the TV show Devil in Disguise. Um and for me personally, in all the 8 episodes, it was just as horrifying as it was ignorantly funny. Um it definitely did make me think a lot about the system and about the issues that we have when it comes to being incompetent, as well as how confrontational people are about how they come across and how quickly we are to look beyond it in order to feel normal or in order to justify someone else or to not be judgmental. And so, from the very first episode, you had Robert Priest, who was 15 years old, who disappeared after a job interview with Gacy. He was supposed to be home for his mom's birthday, instead, he vanished. Then you had Detective Joe, the only one who took Priest's family seriously. He pushed hard, and even when the system dragged its feet. Now, ironically enough, the captain treated this whole issue as he might be a drug, he might be in a drug addict, or he might just be a runaway kid. Ironically enough, saying, "Hey, my son ran away after a job interview on my birthday," wasn't enough to convey emotions. And I guess because this is such a regular pattern, you see a bunch of kids on the street, you make this assumption. But even for a suburban housewife to be like, "Hey, this seems kind of weird," and there's no reaction, just more of, "Oh, well, that's just the same type of child," is a crazy take as a police captain. And you can even see some of that arrogance and ignorance when he's trying to justify it throughout the TV show. But I'll get to that later, because the very first episode, this is where the mask starts to slip, where Gacy comes off quirky and secretive and overly charismatic, and like a big soft pillow you'd never suspect. But that charm, it's a weapon. The cops almost brushed Robert's disappearance until Detective Joe stepped in. The mom knew something was wrong, but as we know, the system didn't really listen. Now, by the second episode, you can see where Detective Joe kind of realizes that, hey, this guy is just way too weird. And this kind of plays off within the episode because he actually invites them into the house. And from what I could understand, nothing about him seemed right up until that moment he starts talking about being a clown, being a different person, you know. And you can see where the cops, and this is shown all throughout the episode, where he comes across as this overly charming, nice guy who kind of, is aloof. And then he just does this complete 180 where he just can't hide this other part of him that has to say, "This is who I am. This is who I am," and there's a reason that's justifiable to it. And so when the cop goes to the bathroom, which, let's be honest, if he had just kept him on the house, didn't do anything, left them alone, they would have just walked away from it. Detective Joe would have had to do something illegal or whatever to, you know, get the story moving. But seeing as how this was a biopic, and even as a biopic, I thought genuinely he was a mastermind. No, no, no. This guy wanted to be as honest about his evil and then couldn't. Because the very next two victims that kind of get talked about, and these are victims that are getting popped out of his house, and each of them had their own story from, the Robert Pierce kid. Then you had Greg Godzik, who was 17, who worked for Gacy's company, told his family that Gacy was weird, then vanished. Then John Budvach, who was 17, had to pay a dispute with Gacy. Gacy killed him and buried him under the garage. And this is the weirdest scene because he speaks to them after getting caught, after they end up digging up everyone's grave, after he literally exposes himself to his lawyer, who then goes outside and is so horrified. He tells the police, "Hey, I don't think I could actually, like, you know, keep an eye on him, kind of giving him a warning that this dude was just mad. This dude also has a kid and justifies the idea that he's just being a good lawyer. And he kind of plays into this role of we all need a defense, which is very much true. But in his consideration, he has some level of sympathy or some relationship with him that's weird in the sense that you can't have a relationship with this type of man because he couldn't have a relationship with two of his wives, two of his stepchildren, or two of his biological children who he used to kind of spearhead his false life. During this time, not only were they abused and scared, but when they left, he didn't go and find them, probably because he knew that his nature would end up hurting them. So then you get Detective Bill Knuckle, who starts connecting the dots between missing boys and the Gacy's business that he owned. Gacy's manipulation is in full swing. He's cracking jokes, playing innocent, and even charming the cops. But he's also stuffing bodies under the house, which produces a smell that I guess he was so used to being around, which is seen with Jeffrey Dahmer case, where, serial killers are so used to being around dead bodies they can't smell it, that's how he gets caught. So when they're digging up all these bodies, after telling a lawyer while he was drunk all the stuff he did, he just walks to the garage and is like, "Hey, I buried this guy over a dispute. He's a bad guy." He doesn't take the law into consideration, doesn't take his lawyer into consideration, because he genuinely believes with all his heart that he's justified in this. And this is something that's seen all throughout it, where then you get to the next episode with Samuel Stapleton, who's 14, and Randy Redford, who's 15. Best friends from uptown Chicago disappeared together and found buried side by side. Detective Allen helped identify the boys. Karen Kazuma, a family member who fought for answers. This one hurts. Two kids just walking home. Gacy snatched them like they were nothing. The show finally gives them their faces, stories, and humanity, and the system still patronizes them, still dismisses them, and the boys weren't just runaways, they were taken and kidnapped. So then you kind of start getting an idea that he's going after young boys, and throughout the show, he treats it as almost sort of, "I'm helping you to take something from you," which is classic. But Billy was labeled as a troublemaker, so no one looked for him. Gacy's psychological evaluation is a joke. He talks about stealing his mom's panties and blames his dad. It's sad, it's twisted, but it's not an excuse. The system let him slide because they didn't care enough to dig deeper. And so by the fifth episode, you get Billy and Carol, last seen at Gacy's house, and the other one found buried beside Billy. Police finally finds a survivor of Gacy and tried to warn the police a year earlier, and they ignored him. He was Jeffrey Rignall. This is where the crawl space becomes a graveyard, and Billy and Daniel eventually start to learn about the type of position that they're putting themselves into, because you find out that he tried to stop this, Jeffrey, and when he filed a report, he begged them to listen, but they didn't. And the more kids died. That's not just a failure, that's complacency. And so, complicity. And so then you get a situation where Timothy, who was 20, and James Mazzaro, who was 21, older victims, still vulnerable, still forgotten. And you realize that the judge presided over the trial, Judge Louis Garfio, and then David Cram, Gacy's employee turned key witness. Gacy starts talking calm, smug, like it's a TED talk. He blames everyone but himself. And then the family sit through it, hoping for closure, but all they get is more pain. David Cram's testimony is brutal. He saw the crawl space. He knew, and he had to live with that. So, David Talsma, 19, one of the last known victims, Bill Kunkel, leads the prosecution. Jeff Cooley wrote a book about Gacy's insanity, complicating the trial. The trial is a circus. Gacy writes letters to the judge, complains about the witnesses, tried to play the victim, but the families. They're the real victims, and they're barely heard. The system wants the clean conviction, not the messy truth. And what's even worse is during this time there was so much issues against homosexuality, it wasn't considered a, even possible for a man to rape another man, which is a crazy statement to make because that would imply that molestation didn't exist because he was raping a young boy. So even if it wasn't about homosexuality, there's just a lack of consideration towards men. And somehow, some way, we only care about the male side of who we are and not the the young side of who we are, not the adult side of who we are, which really matters because young boys actually see this. And if you treat them like they're the worst because you believe they can handle it past the age of 18, it's almost like flipping their entire world upside down, whether you agree with homosexuality or not. When someone talks about trauma, especially a man, and he's open about it and very specific and emotional, that's something that should be heard because I feel like that's too rare of a situation. And then the next episode, the final episode, Elizabeth, Harold Priest, and Mr. Bakovich and others ride the bus to witness the execution, but they're lied to. They didn't see anything. They were actually held in a separate room. Captain Joe smiles after the execution after being told that this is a win. Take the win because he's starting to be curious about whether or not there's actually 33 more murders because they're finding out that there's even other murders linking him towards different states, that there might have been more. This episode is rage, and the families were promised closure. Instead, they got a screen and a lie. The moms stare at the captain. That's the whole show. Like, literally the whole show. She's not just angry, she's done. And the captain, he knows. He understands and he knows that Gacy may be dead, but the system that let him live for so long is still breathing. My final verdict towards this whole show is that this isn't just a documentary. It's a horror story about trust, failure, and how evil hides in plain sight. Gacy was pure evil, not because he was gay, not because he was abused, but because he chose to destroy lives. In the system, it led him. Over and over, no excuses, no gray area, there was no black and white. Let me know if you could really see the system the way that it is and still pretend like it's not a big deal. Because as a response to this, you get situations where eventually people start to adapt. And that's where you find out that he was one of the motivators towards the Amber Alert, which I used to be annoyed by, but now that I've actually seen this story and the puppet scene, oh man, that actually had me cry. And I can definitely tell you that he was the worst patronizing villain that I had ever seen in a story. And I'm probably not going to watch any more true crime stories just for my own mind because I used to have a thing against Amber Alerts always coming up annoying, kind of taking over the phone. But when you understand that this dude was not a smart mastermind, he literally just did what he wanted, put on a smile, act jolly. And it was enough for him to spearhead a stigma towards people who are excited. Because even today, I'll see somebody and be like, he's weird. But there's a difference between being aloof and then just playing a role. And throughout it, it just felt like he was playing a role. Even when the correctional officers knew who he was still able to manipulate them. There was literally no hate outside of the families. And when there was, it was the detective. And it felt like, as much as I didn't respect him, it didn't make me respect police officers anymore. And so I would definitely say that this was a harrowing experience that, you know, I send out my prayers. And that's my review on Devil in Disguise. Goodbye.